We are now going to get into part two of our community ecology. And this part particularly has a lot of new stuff, some things that we briefly introduced your previous biology classes, but a lot of this stuff is going to be new. And starting, let's just dive right in and first talk about succession. So succession, by definition, is the predictable change of species over time. And basically, what we're saying here is that life doesn't just, snap a finger and have it appear, or there's no magic wand that says, okay, let's have a forest. And so it does take time for life to change. And the other thing, too, is that not all areas will end up being this pristine forest. Not all areas have good weather, good soil. And so a lot of what we're talking about with succession also has those abiotic or non-living factors that can influence what it ends up being. So with succession, we have two different kinds. We have primary succession and we have secondary succession. The keys are that primary succession, there is no life there before. There is no soil. It is essentially starting from scratch. It's starting from zero. And we don't have as much of this happening on Earth anymore because our Earth's plates and continents have stayed pretty steady for now millions, if not billions of years. One place that we do see this, though, is in Hawaii, where that hotspot volcanism is creating new islands, it's creating new lands, and so it is starting from scratch. Other areas that we can see this would be, for example, Iceland, where you actually have two plates that are going apart, and so new lands are being created. Now, it's not like what you see in Hollywood where lava comes out and it's going to harden and create new land. It's a very, very slow process, but new lands are being created there. And then another one that we see that doesn't have anything to do with plates would be when glaciers recede and then they never come back. We know that our Earth's temperatures are rising and that glaciers are not always returning. And so that leaves new lands to potentially be colonized as well. Secondary succession is where there is life there before and soil is established. And so if I ask, all right, which one of these do you think takes longer, primary or secondary? Without doubt, primary takes longer. And so again, if we just take a look at those pictures, the picture on the left is showing primary. We're starting with barren rock. And so there is a pattern that the area takes in order to really get life to colonize. And we'll talk about those momentarily. Secondary, life is there. A lot of the seeds are still in the soil. And so we see this actually around us quite a bit, is if a farmer plows his field and then decides not to plant in the spring, well, that's a type of secondary succession. You still have soil there, but then you start to get like weeds, you start to maybe get some shrubs. If that was to continue to happen, perhaps you would start to get some smaller trees and potentially eventually a forest. So those first creatures that colonize an area are what we call pioneer species. Just like, when America was colonized, they're oftentimes referred to as pioneers. So creatures that are able to survive on basically nothing and basically are able to survive on barren rock and maybe some moisture with rain, those are pioneer species. And they are vital because what they do is they start to break down the rock and start the soil formation process. As they start to live and, of course, die, and then live and die, they return some of their own self into the soil and create a little bit of organic material. And that creates just a tiny, tiny little bit of better soil. And that process can potentially continue for a really, really long time. Other pioneer species that you might have heard of would be some very, very simple moss. As we know, moss doesn't take much as long as you have water, and like I said, a little bit of nutrients, they're going to be able to survive. So if that process is able to happen, plus the weathering of things like rain, of ice, of snow, and break down that rock, you start to get some very primitive and very early soil. And as we look at how that area might mature over time, then we get things like grasses. Then we get things like maybe some weeds. Then we might get some very, very small like shrubs. Then we might get more woody shrubs. And then finally maybe we get some basic trees. And the more life you get, the more death you get. The more death you get, the more organic material is returned to the soil. And so eventually an area will reach its climax. And what we mean by climax is what is the max, the best, the keystone species that that area can sustain or hold on to. And so, again, if we're a grassland, the grassland is the climax. The reason why a grassland is because there's not enough water there to support trees. So that's where it levels out. It can't go any further. Why does a rainforest have a forest? Well, there's so much water there. Water is the number one factor of what kind of vegetation you have. So if you have a lot of water, guess what? You're probably going to have trees. If you don't have much water, what are you going to have? Probably grass. If you don't have much water at all, what are you going to have? Well, then you start to get into a desert community where you get a lot of what are called cam plants, things like cacti that are able to hold on to what little water is available in those deserts. So long story short is that not everything can be a forest because the abiotic factors don't necessarily rely on those. And so another vocab word, so that's the climax community, is what we call a keystone species. So what are some of those species that say, all right, you have reached a climax, you have met the max that you can be. And so for us around Minnesota, our keystone species is usually like an oak tree, a white-tailed deer, a coyote. Up north, it might be aspen trees, it might be spruce trees, a wolf, and a moose. If you're a grassland, it might be the Kentucky bluestem or various types of grass, and then it might be for example, various insects that live there and that are able to help pollinate those things. So a keystone species is like what's the best species that can live in that area because of those abiotic factors that can live there. All right, shifting gears now, let's talk about when we get species that are introduced to an area and then they kind of or they can take over. And sometimes we call these invasive species. And the reason why invasive species can be so detrimental or bad for an area is because they don't have any natural enemies. You think about what would happen if rabbits didn't have coyotes and fox to eat them. Well, we'd have a heck of a lot of rabbits running around. What would happen if, we didn't have all the birds to eat the insects? Well, we'd have to wear mosquito nets like all the time because they'd be everywhere. So when we talk about a new species or an invasive or an exotic species means that it has left that area's homeland. So, for example, in Minnesota, we have the European common buckthorn. We might have the Russian olive. We might have the Asian carp. So it tells us where it came from, and then the reason why they are so good at taking over the area, as we saw from the previous slide, is they have no enemies. And so because of that, they can basically take over an area with little to no ill will. They're just saying, hey, this is a good area, let's go. Now, eventually, sometimes those exotic species that come from other places, they start to do get enemies or they start to do get predators, and so it levels out. For example, the ringneck pheasant that we have is actually from China, but the ringneck pheasant isn't invasive. Why? Well, because a lot of things eat the ringneck pheasant. Fox, coyotes, there are a lot of things that like to snack on a pheasant. So what I'm saying here is not all exotic species are invasive. It just means that they come from other places. And so if we look at some examples of these invasive species, as we just said, rabbits, they can reproduce like crazy. Vines, sometimes they can be invasive and basically outchoke and outcompete the native plants. Sometimes we can remedy the situation by, coming up with uses for those. Here you're seeing a scientist. She said, I'm going to make these vines into a basket, and I'm going to sit in a basket. I don't know why she did that, but with Asian carp, unfortunately, there's not a high diet for Asian carp. People don't like eating them. They're really bony, and they're hard to eat. So sometimes these exotic species and invasive species, they take over because we don't have a use for them yet or at all. Lastly, I'd like to talk about endangered species. So these are creatures that are vulnerable to extinction. And these endangerments can happen in so many different ways. Unfortunately, humans are one of the number one factors of making species become endangered. Unfortunately, we have taken over their habitats. Unfortunately, we have hunted creatures. Unfortunately, we have messed up migration patterns. Unfortunately, we have made rivers change, and we have, changed lakes because of our boating and that sort of stuff. So, endangered species can happen naturally, but also we as humans need to kind of look ourselves in the mirror and understand that we do have an effect on these creatures that call Earth home, and that it can have a big influence on an area. And so, in closing, this brings up or kind of concludes our topics with chapter 46. We did have some newer things here, so make sure you're spending your time taking a look at that new stuff. We would expect you to remember things like, the different relationships and those things, but there's also a lot of new stuff that happened in this chapter. So, thanks for listening, and we appreciate your attentiveness.